Hi, this is Phil McCauley for Labour Business TV, and I'm very delighted to be joined today by my special guest, Jennifer Nadel, award-winning journalist, author, broadcaster, and writer of We, a manifesto for women, a bestseller, an extraordinary tome, and now the founder and co-founder of Compassion in Politics. Jennifer, welcome. How are you right now? How's COVID treating you? How are you coping?
I'm really well, thank you, Phil, and it's lovely to be here talking to you this morning.
Well, good, and I hope you're coping with the pandemic and the second wave like everybody else is. I've been particularly fascinated looking at your career so far, your journey to the extraordinary activism that is really highlighted by your work in finding time to co-found Compassion in Politics. But before we talk about that, talk to me about your journey. You started in broadcast journalism, I think, and went from there. What was your experience in that area, and how's that informed you for what you're doing now?
Well, I actually started in the law. I originally qualified as a barrister, and since the age of 14, I have just been motivated by a desire to try and reduce the level of social inequality. My father had a really severe case of Parkinson's, so I knew what it was like to be a child carer, and that informed my politics. So originally I went to the bar thinking that the way to change things and make society fairer was through changing laws. And I realized it was going to take me a long time to be arguing cases in the Supreme Court. So I switched to journalism, and I was incredibly lucky and got to work for all the main broadcasters. And it was a wonderful opportunity because one could make reports on the things which upset one most and bring them to the attention and call ministers to account. Although the broadcasting arena has obviously shifted since then. You know, at the time, ITV, for example, was owned by lots of different companies, and now it has to compete for its share of the audience, and the BBC increasingly as well, which means that it's harder and harder to do the kind of investigative and campaigning journalism that I was lucky enough to do.
Yes, and so as you think about your training as a barrister, your sort of forensic approach to the law, has that been helpful in your journalism?
Certainly the rigour, and also just understanding a bit more about the levers that you can pull. I would say in my activism, it's been incredibly helpful because people don't often think about legal remedies, but there are often legal remedies out there. For example, at the moment in Compassion in Politics, we are looking at the role that online hate plays in driving people out of politics, particularly women and people of colour, and looking at whether or not we can bring a class action on the basis of negligence. You know, Twitter are constantly allowing information to be put onto its platform. We accept that the battle to have them declared a publisher has been lost, but nevertheless, it's reasonably foreseeable that someone reading death and rape threats on their platform is going to suffer harm as a result of that. So there are often many ways that the law can be brought in to help with campaigning. Similarly, we ran a campaign to try and stop the lying in politics, and had a legal team there drafting a bill of what it would look like if we actually made it an offence to deliberately mislead the voting public. It strikes me as insane that you can't sell a car by misrepresenting what the car is, whether it really has four wheels or whether the engine really is under the bonnet. And yet you can put figures on the side of a bus that are completely fabricated and there are no consequences. So the law, I think, has many uses that can be brought into campaigning in particular, and need to, because at the moment there is just not enough accountability in politics, and that's one thing. Thankfully, we still have the courts with their relative degree of independence that can bring an element of accountability into play.
That's very interesting, but of course the courts system itself is under attack now by Cummings and Johnson attempting to subvert and undermine the authenticity of the judiciary and their independence. So what's the approach that you need to take to that?
Well, it's really frightening because I came of political age at the same time as Thatcher took office. So I've been through a number of big political struggles, the miners' strike, Wapping, all of these fights, clause 28, all of these battles that we have fought where there's just been a clear enemy. There's been people who are doing things that are dangerous to the well-being of our society, and those who are trying to prevent it. But now we have a much less clear enemy, because what's happening is that the fundamental checks and balances that exist in our world are being dismantled, and it's really insidious. And the courts are one example. We also have the BBC. We also have the civil service. I mean, it is absolutely terrifying what's happening to the neutrality of the civil service. So basically, anyone who can provide any opposition is effectively being nobbled. And, it's interesting for me, because when I was at the bar, judges were seen as these right-wing, bastions of preserving the state. And I don't think judges have changed, but the fact that judges are now the place where the left goes to try and protect what's left really says a lot about how politics has shifted and how the whole political framework has shifted.
It's very fascinating. Now, you've got a lot of support for compassion in politics across the board, across different areas of politics. But how can compassion in politics confront what has clearly become the populist methodology of just outright lying continuously and never having to be called to account? What can you do about that? The legal action strikes me as a very strident and potent field. Is there any chance that we can actually persuade people to come on board with the idea of being decent as a society again?
I believe there really is. And the problem with this post-fact fake news era is that we can no longer argue about the facts, because people have their own narratives that they've got from wherever they've got them, and they're not going to let go of them. So we do have to bring the argument to a different place. And that is about who are we as human beings? And compassion is innate. Children by the age of 2 get distressed if they see someone else upset or crying. It's built into us. It is in all of our natures. And we as a people, you can see what happened during COVID, the extent to which communities came together, families came together, strangers came together, and we really showed how compassionate we are as a people. So I don't think there's a problem with us accessing our compassion. I think there's a problem with where politics has gone. It's completely divorced itself from those values which most of us practice in our daily lives, and which politicians themselves will always say that their motivation for coming into politics is to make the world a better place, to try and do something about suffering and injustice. And yet they have completely drifted away from that purpose, and it's become about winning. It's become about power grabs. It's become about being right. And they have become disconnected from that moral compass. And so I think that it's a really, really strong lever to pull, because it's what voters want. We've done lots of polling and we know that that's what voters want. And politicians need to start listening and coming back to centre and coming back to the values, because in the absence of fact, that is something innate that we all have inside us, our humanity. And thankfully that hasn't been erased yet.
Yes, I agree. And that sounds very hopeful. Turning to the question of what happens next in politics, I mean, at the moment, we're living through this sort of Trumpian, Johnsonian era of buffoonery and incompetence. And that's been fostered by very strong right-wing media interests, as far as I can see. How is that going to be able to be combated? Because, no one seems to be bothered about the rule of law anymore now. Politicians break the law with impunity. There are politicians who are absent from Parliament right now who've been arrested, and we don't even know their name in public, although we all know, we think, who that might be. And the reality is, what is happening in Britain to those kind of civil liberties?
Well, it's incredibly worrying, as you say, but that's what's happening on the extremes. There is still, a vast majority right in the middle who do care about the rule of law, who do care about what's happening to society, who don't want to see refugees drowning at sea, who don't want to see food banks as being just a normal part of everyday life. I mean, how did that happen to our country with its wonderful welfare state, that we now have an increasing number of families living on the breadline? We have a rising rate of infant mortality. You know, we're the fifth, sixth richest country in the world, and we have a rising rate of infant mortality. It is so shocking. And the vast majority of people do care about that, but they feel pretty powerless. And so what we have to do is connect people with the power that they do have, because that's a lie. We're not powerless. That's what those operating on the extremes want us to feel, just to surrender and say there's nothing I can do. But actually together we make up the vast majority. And one of the things that we at Compassion in Politics do is provide a neutral vehicle for politicians of all parties to come together. And if we're looking for silver linings, one of them has to be the number of Conservative politicians who risked their careers and said no to Johnson in the last Parliament. And similarly, the number of people in the Labour Party who said no to anti-Semitism and took stands. And there is an increasing return to that value-led politics by politicians who haven't been co-opted into the two extremes at either side of the political spectrum. So I remain really hopeful, and certainly talking to some of the Conservative MPs who are, you know, have taken over the Labour seat, the Redwall Labour seats, many of them share values that are not nearly as far from Labour as one might think or fear. I'm not saying that it's the same, but I am saying that those of us who have values that are in one accord, irrespective of our party, really have to come together. And obviously we had this moment where a new party was invented, which failed pretty quickly. But that's because we don't really need a new party. We have, you know, the parties that we have. What we need is new alliances, which can happen right now. You don't need to invent a new machine. You just need to say, I want a compassionate Britain and I want compassionate policies. And the job of government is to take care of everybody in society, regardless of socioeconomic background or ethnicity. And that simply isn't what we've got at the moment.
Yes, I understand. And as we think about the changes that have happened specifically in the Labour Party in the last few months, we've seen a complete wholesale change of leadership. Keir Starmer coming in, a brand new shadow cabinet team, and a shift, I mean, very clearly towards the centre left from a much more extreme position under Jeremy Corbyn by the account of all commentators, really. How's he doing, and what is your message to him as he starts to grapple with the question of policy rather than just responding to the pandemic and to Brexit and being in the opposition, doing a job as opposition? But what should he be thinking about now as he lays the framework for Labour policy for the next few years leading up to the election? What should he be thinking about now?
I think he should be coming back down to the basics that we all agree with, that we cannot have a country where it's acceptable for people to be hungry, where the lowest paid cannot manage on their salary, where benefits are not enough to feed your family on, where you can't actually get housing benefit that meets the cost of your rent, where some councils are still charging council tax to people on benefits. There is so much low-hanging fruit which just really goes against the British longing for a sense of fair play and justice. And I think it needs to be values-led. I think it needs to talk to the values that all of us have. He cannot just be talking to the Labour Party. He has to be talking to the whole political spectrum, because there are many people who dislike what is happening and who are there and could be returning to Labour or voting for Labour for the first time if he can connect with those core values that run through all of us as human beings. The other thing I would love to see him adopt is one of the mechanisms that Compassion in Politics is proposing, which is that we create a simple threshold, which means that you can't pass a new law without first ensuring that it's not going to harm the most vulnerable members of society. We have similar provisions with the Equality Act, where you have to do an audit and see what the impact would be on certain groups before legislation can be passed. The same with climate change. And now we need to do that. What is going to be the impact on levels of poverty and avoidable suffering if a measure is passed? And I think to create some kind of basic right that can be protected in there would really afford us protection going forward, and particularly if we end up in another situation where the government in power thinks that austerity and you know, destroying those who have least is really an important thing to put on their agenda.
So essentially, that would be very radical to eliminate legally the possibility of austerity being used so brutally as Cameron and Osborne and Nick Clegg did when they became in office in 2010, and the incredible devastation, the creation of food banks, the creation of Brexit, the creation of the sort of poverty that we've seen in our country, making that not able to be enacted legally anymore, I think would be a great position. Turning to your legal mind and your barrister hat on for a moment, I mean, how could that be done? You're talking about a threshold, so you're talking about setting a standard where perhaps legislation can't come into law if it is shown in reality to have those effects. Is that the kind of measure you have in mind?
It is, and it could be done through a human rights framework. In other words, we all have the right to life, in a sense, to food, to shelter, to healthcare, and to education, that those are basic rights which we all as humans have in a developed society, and those rights need to be met. But as civil liberties is something that is quite hard to argue for in the current political framework, we see it as something that's probably more palatable to soft conservative voters as well as to those on the left, which is a threshold, which is that you have to show that legislation is not going to cause harm to the most vulnerable in society. And it's not rocket science. You know, we've done it for the climate, we've done it for equality, and I think we need to do it for those marginalized people who are being tipped into still greater poverty before it gets any worse.
Yes, I understand. I mean, in a sense, the Tories have had to have almost a sort of conservative version of some form of minimum basic income, haven't they, during COVID? Do you think a minimum basic income is the kind of guarantee that citizens ought to expect in order to guarantee the avoidance of poverty and destitution and food bankery? Is that the kind of measure that we need to aim for?
Absolutely, and it's on our agenda, very much at the heart of it, at Compassion in Politics, because to have benefits that don't give people enough to live on, to have people in work but the wage they're earning is not enough to live on, is ludicrous, and it's also incredibly expensive and incredibly divisive. So yes, it's absolutely pointless paying people or giving people benefits that don't amount to a living wage. And some fantastic work, as I'm sure you know, has been done at Loughborough University and at York, looking at what level that would be. Again, it's not rocket science. We can work that out, and actually ensuring that everyone has that base income, whether it's through, you know, a universal basic income or whether it's through, you know, wages and benefit levels, is a complete no-brainer. It will save money for the health service, it will save money for the education system, it will save money across the board, and it will make this nation a lot healthier, happier, and less divided.
Finally, thinking about what you've just said about compassion in politics, I'd like to ask you this. What is your message to young people who've grown up in an era of conservative austerity? They've reached a stage now where they're in quarantine at university or in their apprenticeship or unemployed, and they're thinking about their future, and they're starting to think about activism and different forms of life ahead for them. What is your message to them? What have you learned on your journey that you can say to those young people to inspire them and help them think about what they should do with their lives going forward?
I think to not compromise themselves. You know, we have been sold a pup. We've been told that if we work hard and tick certain boxes, we will then get somewhere that makes us feel safe and makes us feel fulfilled. But that's not necessarily the case. The thing certainly that I have discovered in my life is that being true to your values and your principles brings far greater rewards than any status or financial reward can. And also I would say to them that there, you know, was a time in this country where amazing things existed, and that time could come again, when we had a welfare state that really worked, when we had an education system that worked, when we had a health service that worked. And these things are not some utopian socialist idea. These are real things that any basic country could have. So don't abandon those visions and dismiss them as idealistic. We can create a much fairer society where all of us have the opportunity to reach our own levels of fulfillment that we as humans should be able to reach. And just because it's not happening now doesn't mean that if we don't all engage with that project, it can't happen in the future, and that COVID gives us the opportunity to really start bringing about change, because it's dismantled the old order. It's brought down emissions, it's brought down flying, it's brought down industry in the way that we know it, and we can rebuild a much fairer society from the ashes of what COVID has created.
Well, on that happy note,
Sorry.
thank you.
It was meant to be happy. I think it is happy. I do feel hopeful. I do feel hopeful because something has created a chink, and if enough of us can mobilize to use that chink to make something fairer, to build back better, then we'll all be better off for it.
Jennifer Nadel, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Great to talk.